Okay. Welcome everyone to the next installation in our advanced user webinar series for OpenAir. The topic this month is dashboard and metrics. If there was some confusion on the website, I do apologize. We had to switch topics, but dashboard and metrics will be the focus today. And we'll be going through a couple of examples of typical metric dashboards, and then I'm going to take you into our sandbox environment where I'm going to show you how to configure the graph the way that you would like as far as row control or column control, company rows, and grand totals, subtotals. You'll see the difference because I've compared and contrasted different types of reports so that you can see how those graphics react. I'm just going to check and make sure. Okay. And then we'll go into how you can make some advanced graphical dashboards and metrics by taking advantage of the custom calculation features within OpenAir and how you can leverage things like constants to redefine brand new values in your reporting and thus be able to interpret those into dashboards and be able to see a lot of the key metrics that you're tracking probably in spreadsheets or in Excel charts through the OpenAir system with dynamic data. So let's go ahead and take a look at some dashboards here. The graphical dashboards that Top Step uses quite a bit really focus more on metric trending and making sure we have things like timesheet compliance. And it's just a really quick visual way to interpret the report information that you are typically running out of OpenAir, or you know the data is in OpenAir and you would like to get it out and view it in some way, typically for management reports or board meetings and things like that. So even on this slide here, you can see how you can trend forecast information, average bill rates, find out how your different service packages or offerings are flourishing within the fiscal year, and revenue things. But you can also consider items like utilization is a big thing, billable hours, margin percent, capacity versus demand. All of those are metrics that in an operational model you'll need to make sure that you're meeting certain targets to keep your business on track. So let's take a real typical one that we see quite often in graphical dashboards, and that's hours and utilization analysis. And even in this simple example, we're using actually the OpenAir standard fields of billed hours and unbilled hours. Now, many of you on the phone or attending this webinar or listening to this webinar may not be able to use those direct standard fields, and I'll show you a way that you can actually create your own versions of those fields. But just for simplicity's sake, without having to get into custom calculations quite yet, let's just say the timesheet billed hours and timesheet unbilled hours are values that are valid in your system setup. They're useful as far as understanding how many hours have been recorded that are billed to clients or unbilled to clients. And you really want to set up a graph to reflect that. Okay? So on this slide here, you see just a couple of typical examples of give me the comparison of billable hours versus non-billable hours and then conversion of that into utilization. Right? But what I'd like to do at this point is show you how you can change the same information to look differently in the dashboards by exchanging row and column information, company level information, or drill down information by person, for example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you into our system. And you'll see here in a dashboard, I've actually set up a dashboard tab called column and row. And in this first example, what I've done is I've set up a report, a very simple report. And what it does is show by person the projects that the person is working on. And for the month of April, this again is a very simple example, the month of April, how many hours did the person that was billed and how many hours were unbilled? Straightforward. And if I go back to the dashboard, you'll see that actually these two graphs are using the exact same report, but they're displaying the data very differently. And why is that? The reason that they're displaying the data very differently is they're using the difference is using what's called the grand total field. Okay, So in this billed hours, non-billable hours row view, I call it, I'm really pulling that report that I just showed you, plus the billed hours and unbilled hours, and saving this value. Okay? There's also a feature here called Use Grand Totals, but at this point it's unchecked. When you set up a dashboard like this using the vertical multi-bar, it's going to actually change the x-axis to be the first level of the rows in your report. So if you refresh your memory about what we just saw, the report is subtotaled initially by user, and under the user are the projects. Okay? So if I go back to the dashboard, you'll see that just by using this simple row the vertical multi-bar chart, each of those subtotals shows up on the x-axis, with each of these columns being the two columns of information, billed hours and unbilled hours. The challenge here, however, is trying to figure out which of these columns is billed hours and which of these is non-billable, simply because in the legend it tells you what is the time index, the month of April. Okay? I lose the information as to tell me what is the meaning of the red versus the green. And here you have to use naming conventions to kind of keep track of that. But contrast that to the one next to it, which is exactly the same setup, with the one features change of checking the grand totals checkbox. Okay? This is the exact same setup, but I've checked the grand totals, and you'll see the difference on how the information is displayed. When you use grand totals, it actually ignores the rows. So I like to call the grand totals more of a column view. So if you don't use grand total, that's more of a row view. So when you check the grand total, you'll get actually in the x-axis now is an index into the time frame. Okay? Because as you can see from these graphs, the dashboard graphs, it uses 2 dimensions, and that's the limitation, is 2 dimensions. So I have to have 2 dimensions, so the x-axis now becomes the time, which is the month of April, and the measurements show me in the legend the fact that I have 2 columns in that time period. It's the billed hours and unbilled hours. Very, very clear in this example what color means what. Okay? But as you know, by looking at the comparison of these 2 charts that are using the exact same report, I lose detailed data with the right-hand chart. On the left-hand chart, I have to make sure I interpret the information as to what the green and the red mean. Okay? That's a really important distinction between how to set up the dashboards and what do you actually want the dashboard to reflect, detail or legend information to make it much more clear. Now in this single month example, both of these views are actually equally valid and equally useful. But let's expand this to be a multi-month report. So what I did is I used the exact same report and I just added 2 more months to it. So it shows the exact same information, billed and unbilled, but it repeats it for the month of April, May, and June. So then I set up these exact same charts using the exact same setups. The row view does not have the grand totals. The right-hand side, which is the column view, has the grand totals. It can see how the information is actually communicated better by using the column view when you start dealing with trending or timeline data. Okay? On the left-hand side, we have the billable, non-billable hours row view. Again, it takes the first subtotal row, which is the individual names. But unfortunately, because it can only do 2 indexes into the system, the legend now is focused more on the time frame because we don't want to lose time frame index, April, May, June. But what is below that is April for billed and unbilled, May for billed and unbilled, June for billed and unbilled. Unfortunately, that is a 3rd index, which the dashboards can't handle. So you can see here it had to pick something, and it actually picks the billed hours value. So as you go to trend information, trying to trend it by person becomes difficult if you're trying to trend multiple values for each of those time periods. So the trending aspect ends up being, for individuals, you have to pick a single value for it to work, or you start losing data. Otherwise, you can make it more of generalized and looking at month-by-month comparisons and shows you the billed hours versus unbilled hours for each of the months. This is a nice trending when you're looking at general information, maybe by department, maybe by the company, but you're not looking at it necessarily by a breakdown of the rows or the subtotals in the report. So as you trend information over time, you'll see that this column view tends to be a more appropriate dashboarding technique than the row view, which breaks things down into detail. Okay? So just to kind of recap that, if I clicked into the report, if you're using rows to capture information, subtotaling by something, stick with a single time date value. And here we have 2 date values in OpenAir. The dashboarding can't see both of those in a row view. So you have to pick, it picks one and it picks the build hours. Okay. So if I'm trending this over time, it has to only pick one value because the time frame is index number 1, the user is index number 2. I know as TopStep started to use the dashboards, it was always difficult to kind of understand when would rows show up versus column data. And so I figured this would be a great opportunity to show you and compare and contrast, even with very simple reports, where the controls work and what would work best in your environment. Now let's take yet one more view of this information, and you'll see here the same row view versus column view information, same build and unbuild. However, I've changed the report slightly to leave the company row. So what does that mean, the company row? When you run a report and build a summary report in the system, sometimes you'll start with a company level report, and what that means is the very first subtotal is the company name. In this example, it's Example Inc. Okay? In many cases, people will hide this row so they can get down to this lower level of detail. In this case, I'm exposing the row and I'm showing the row. So as we go back to the dashboard, the thing to keep in mind here is the row view of a dashboard can only see the first level. And in this case, if you leave the company row there, that is the first level. That's the only thing it can see. So as you can see here, the x-axis becomes the row level. And actually, I have to resave this to have Example Inc. show up correctly. But this is the first level of the report, and therefore it's example. And you can see here, again, it's taking the 2 indexes, the row index and then a column index. And since there's multiple months, it has to pick the month. So I lose the information about the non-billable hours because this is April billable, May billable, June billable. It can't show me April billable, non-billable because that would be 2 more indexes and it can't handle that. However, if I flip it to the column view, which is again using those grand total checkbox, I now get month by month detail along with the build unbilled hours. And the interesting thing is compare the 2 charts here using the company row in this chart down here, the second chart, and the non-company row but using the grand totals in the chart above it. They look exactly the same. It's because they are exactly the same. The grand totals treats everything as a roll-up to the top level, and by nature of a company report, that roll-up has already happened because you're using the company row as the first row, and it's the grand total as well. So these 2 values are exactly the same. But these 2 are very different. This is because first level is company. The one above it shows you the first level is user. Okay, so I always found it very interesting to understand when can I get the rows versus the columns to appear, and really it's the key is that grand totals checkbox when you're dealing with multiple bars. Now what about line charts? How can I get multiple lines to show up on a chart? Okay, and again the trick here with the line charts, you don't have a choice between row and column view. The trick is you have to get rows to show up that are representative of each line that you want to show. Okay? So here on the right-hand side, you have this single line that shows the billable hours in a line version, same exact information. It's showing billable hours in this line view. And if I take a look at how it's set up, it's actually pointing to the same exact report as the ones above it that are the multi-vertical line, multi-bar vertical views. Okay. These two are using the same report, but when I do a compare line view, it's going to only pick one value because it only has one row that it can show. And that's because I'm actually using the company roll-up, the company summary, example Inc. Okay? So as it's got the single row in it, and I'll click through to show you the report. It's got this single row, and on a line chart, the rows rule. So this only has a single row with multiple subtotals underneath it. This single row is what will show up on the graph in the line. And because the line can only handle one value, it will pick the first value in the column, which is the billed hours. Okay? But you really want multiple lines. How do I get multiple lines so I can compare and contrast things like forecast versus actual, plan versus actual, billing versus revenue? How do I get all of that on the same exact graph? And the key really is, how can you get that information subtotaled by those value types on the left-hand side? How can you get a subtotal called forecast and a subtotal called actual so that you have two different subtotals, like similar to Team Admin and Cindy Brady, so that you get two subtotals that can represent two lines? So let's go back to the dashboard, and you'll see that I did have a multi-line row, or a multi-line dashboard available. And here's an example of a multi-line dashboard. Shows the exact same information about the billable hours that each person has, which is the same values. If you go up and compare it against these earlier charts, you'll see that these values match the values down here on the lines. But you'll see I have multiple lines. But if you look at the legend, the multiple lines are representing people. What does that mean? That means if I click into this, the report is set up so that the first level, or the row, is people. So as long as I'm able to get a subtotal of the rows, I can get different lines to show up on that graph. Okay? The trick has always been, well, I really want these columns to show up as different lines on the report and on the dashboard. And unfortunately, that's not possible. It focuses only on the rows. When you do want to deal with multiple column pieces of data, you will have to use things like the vertical multibars or the horizontal multibars to be able to represent that information in more bar views than line views. Okay, which is not terrible because you can obviously see sort of the trending without a line. But the key for a line chart and the trending of metrics that require a line chart is that you need to be able to get the information in a subtotal format on the summary report. So hopefully that helped you understand some of the different ways that dashboards can be configured just even based on the same report. So let's look at a little more complicated report, such as margin percent. And margin percent is something you actually have to calculate first before you can report on it. And this is where custom calculations come in. I'll touch a little bit on how custom calculations are created, but it's a feature in the administration module where you can build your own equations in the system and generate your own values, and margin percent would be something that you could generate into the system. Once you actually make that field available, now you can use it on configured reports, and if it's on a report, typically it can be brought into some kind of dashboard. With this being a single value, it's perfect for a line graph because then you can index across time. And if you want multiple lines, the key is multiple rows. What do you need to group the information by in order to get multiple lines that reflect a margin percentage? Okay? So let's take a look at how the margin percentage examples are in our sandbox environment. So we have another tab over here called Margin. And at the very bottom, we have the margin that was actually shown in the slide set that shows a trending margin over time and over months of what's going on with Example Inc. Okay? Now, if we click into this report, you'll see that the report is set up to show me everything for Example Inc. And month by month, it has a single value of margin percent. Well, where did that come from? How did margin percent exist? It's not an actual field as defined by default in OpenAir. In this particular example, a custom calculation was used to calculate margin percent. In this configuration, margin is based on invoicing and the cost of time in the system. And if you look at the definition of margin percent, you'll see that it uses an intermediate value called M1 divided by project billing fees or invoice data. Okay? So M1 divided by project billing fees. Well, what the heck is M1? If you go back and look at the custom calculations, M1 is project billing fees minus timesheet all actual cost. So the equation of margin is fees, billing fees minus cost divided by billing fees to get your margin percent. In order to generate that equation in OpenAir, you have to do it in two pieces because the custom calculations only allow two variables in an operand. So for you to be able to do a calculation like this, please make sure you have the internal switch turned on that says allow the use of custom calculations in custom calculations. Otherwise, I would not be able to find M1 to put into this equation. So I defined margin percent that way, and I was able to put that on a report. And then depending on how I set up my report and subtotaled information, I was able to get a trending of a line. Now, what if I want to break down margin by my service packages or my offerings? Some offerings, we have it here at TopStep, our T&M, and some are fixed price, as many of you have as well. So how are we doing in each of those areas, and where are the trends with those margin percentages? So if you look at the chart above, what I simply did is use the exact same report, except I hid the company row. By hiding the company row, the first level of the report becomes the service offering, outsourced activities, other business efficiencies, training, and so forth. If we click into it, similar to the billable hours example we just went through, you'll see that, again, being able to subtotal by certain activities, each of these subtotals are a line. And each line then reflects the value across time. So as long as you can get a subtotal on the rows, you can show that as a line on a line graph. Well, that's great. I can see this, and boy, doesn't that look great. Okay? But then I made a mistake, and I kept the mistake so I could use this on the call here. And I said, well, let me apply the same logic that I applied to the billable and unbillable hours. And the same logic was, well, if I can break this down by lines with each subtotal, well, let me do a quote-unquote column view by checking the grand totals option so that I just get everything rolled up. Shouldn't that work? Shouldn't I be able just to roll everything up across all of these and have it look exactly like this company report version? And just to remind you, the company report version, the first level of this report was Example Inc. Okay? The multi-line version hid this row, and this was the first level, which was the offerings. So I went ahead and did that, and something interesting happened. This margin subtotal grand total line version uses the exact same report as this multi-line version, except I checked the use grand subtotals. And as I look at this, immediately my first thought was, wow, the pattern doesn't look the same. And then I looked at the y-axis, and boy, I did not expect to see 275% margin. That's incredible. Then I realized what it was actually doing. So the grand total checkbox will give you the grand total as it adds things together. That works great in a report like billable hours, because when you do actually run a company report or the grand total version, both are adding the total up. They're adding all of the values up for billed hours. So therefore, the values that you get from a company report versus the individual people grand total, it's adding, and adding one way versus adding a different way means exactly the same thing. The difference here with the margin one is that when I click grand total, it's adding, but when I use the company version, it's averaging, which is a much different thing, because now we're dealing with percentages, which in OpenAir are basically ratios. And when ratio fields are reported in OpenAir, and as subtotals happen, they average information. That's the basic reporting functionality within OpenAir. It doesn't add margins together or margin percentages together. It averages them as you subtotal up each group of items. So in this case, when you're dealing with margins or ratios, percentages, the grand totals are something to stay away from. Okay, so if it's something very simple as far as hours or things that can be added together, grand totals are great on a checkbox. If it's some ratio or percentages, stay away from that grand total, because you'll really get misleading information, as you can see in this example. So I tried something else in the way to get some trending information. And I basically took this exact same report, and I said, I really do want to see information in a bar chart. I want to see some trending information. And these lines are really kind of hard to see because they sort of scribble and cross each other. So I did this same exact report, except I changed it into a multi-vertical bar. And what I liked about this, going back to the billable hours example, is the first subtotal row is what shows up on the x-axis. So each of those subtotals showed up here. And then as you can tell in the legend here, each month is color-coded. And now I can see a pattern very clearly under each one of these service offerings. Okay? And it only can handle one value, so I know this is a margin percent. I wrote the report, and if I click into it, it's going to be the exact same as the line version. So really, it's what is the best way to represent the data. If there's a lot of kind of conflicting or overlapping data that's hard to read with a line graph, consider using a bar graph, a multi-bar graph, because you may be able to get the trending that you want to show up a little more clear. Now, going back to the presentation, let's take this one step further. What if we want to break the margin down, not just by the service offerings, because we have 5 or 6 different service offerings that we're tracking in our system. We want to group those 5 or 6 by general revenue categories. And in this example, I called one revenue category outsourced margin and one revenue category consulting margin. And really what it is each of these is a combination of the different offerings. They roll up into these general categories. Okay? Well, one way you can do it, and the simple way to do it, is say, okay, well, I'm going to write a report, and I'm going to filter this report by the different offerings on my project or my services. Okay? So I hard code a report to say this is the outsourced report, and then I write another one that says this is the consulting report, and I include the same margin percent, but I know the only values that are showing up are outsourced. So I throw them on a dashboard, and I call the dashboard outsourced, so it's very clear it's outsourced data only, and here it's consulting margin data only. Okay, that's one way to do it. Oops. like in this report example, which is all of the offerings, this is by offering, so it's everything's showing in detail. But if I want to break it down into just outsourced and just consulting, if I click into this dashboard to review the report, you'll see that at the top of the report, it's going to tell me that I filtered by service offering, which is actually, well, it's not telling me now, but it's filtered by service offering, which would be outsourced margin, okay, or consulting margin. But what if I got a bit tricky and I really wanted to have both of those values on the same report, okay? So here's where we can come up with our custom calculations again. And this report that we're looking at is exactly how that was done. We created these new fields called outsourced margin and consulting margin. And then I basically built dashboards on top of these various ways. So how did I create these custom fields? Back at the administration module, under the custom calculations, you'll see that I have consulting margin, and consulting margin is the difference between the margin money-wise from consulting divided by the billing that's been done for consulting. Well, these are values that are not standard in OpenAir. How did I come up with these? I created custom calculations to define each of these as well. But there's a bit of a trick in defining these types of additional fields. So let's look at consulting billing money or dollars. Okay. How did I define this new field? Well, consulting billing money is really just project billing fees. Okay, we saw that in the basic margin report. But the project billing fees, in order for me to get the consulting version of it, I need to turn on a feature that allows me to have report filters in the custom calculations. And as you scroll down, you'll see that I've actually filtered this to say, only give me things that fall into the categories, or projects that fall into the categories of these 5 offerings, because I consider those consulting revenue, okay, or consulting invoicing. However, in order for you to define this custom calculation, you actually do have to create an equation. So it's fees times 1. Anything times 1 is anything, right? We all learned that in school. So what's this 1? What's the definition of this 1? So this is where we introduce the concept of constants in the calculations, and that's handled by custom detailed fields. As we look at the custom detailed fields, you'll see that here's number 1, bill. As I open this up, you'll see the definition of this is a constant with the value 1 against a field called project billing transaction. I'm creating an equation that requires me to figure out a value based on project billing fees. That is a project billing transaction. I need a constant of that same type in order to make the equation work cleanly. As I create this constant, you'll pick the field ratio. Ratio is a simplistic way of being able to use the information in an equation. So now I have my constant of 1. I use that to multiply by the standard field of project billing fees to come up with my money for consulting. I do the exact same thing for my outsourced billing money to define that field. And then I continue to go through and create my bill margin the same way, and therefore I can create the final equation, which is the margin percent complete. Lots of pieces to that equation, but at the end of the day, it gets you what you want, which is a unique value that is only containing outsourced revenue, and another unique value that's only containing consulting revenue. And there's really no easy way to group that information in your configuration other than grouping different surface offerings together. So then you go and you write the report. Let's go to the dashboard because it's easier to get to it from the dashboard. So I write the report, and now I have the same example with custom calculations as I did with the unbilled and billed hours example, which were standard fields. I have rows and columns, and how do I want to display that information? So now you're back to the same philosophical debate of what is the way that you want to display the data. Okay? I have 3 indices that I'm dealing with: rows, multiple time columns, and within each time column, multiple columns of data. As I go back to the dashboard, you can see that one way I've chosen to show this information is vertical multi-bar grand total, because that gives me my time index plus my legend. I lose the row information. That was the same example we showed here on the column versus row with the standard fields. This was the company view, grand totals. Here's my date index and my multi-fields. Once I have this report, now I can actually, instead of creating hard-coded 2 different reports, one for outsourced and one for consulting, I can reuse this exact same report and define each of these independently and show the information and the trending side by side. So now I have more options on the way I want to display the data and the way that I want the graphs to appear. So in this slide set, we go through a little bit of an example of what we walk through real time, which is using custom calculations with constant. It's a very powerful tool within the system that allows you to redefine items and create new values so that you can include them on reports. And once they're included on reports, you can then write all kinds of dashboards on top of them. Just to give you some tips on that constant value that we keep talking about, the constant value is best leveraged if it matches the type of field it's being used with in the equation. In our example, we are using project billing transactions. So we defined a constant that was a constant against project billing transactions. When you go to create a custom detailed field and pull down the new menu, you will see a whole plethora of options, and in those options are things like time entry custom detail field, project billing transaction custom detail field, charge custom detail field. All of those items are types of records or types of transactions. If you're creating an equation and you're using, for example, timesheet hours, you would want to use a constant that is against a time entry. If in our example we were using project billing, in that equation we would want to use a constant that's defined against the project billing transaction. So it's really best if you define custom detailed fields according to the transaction type that you're using in the equation. The reason that's important is because that will allow you to subtotal information or average it, in the case of margin percent, very easily in reports. So as you can see, even in these 2 examples, one was standard fields, one was custom calculation, one was an extended custom calculation to filter on certain different types of information. You can actually define any kind of custom field that you want and be able to put that in reports. Think of ways that you've had to create the reports using the standard fields, subtotal it in certain ways, export it in a pivot table and move things around, maybe add a little macro to do stuff. Try it out in OpenAir. Try it out with these features and try it out on a dashboard and play around with it to see if you can get it the trending the way you want. Lines are great with trending, but they don't work in all cases. Vertical multi-bars are a great example on how to set those up. So the tips and tricks that I like to leave everyone with is something that we did not mention while working through the dashboard is the concept of a hierarchy. Some of you are using a hierarchy. You may have called it something different, but it's a way to group information by just kind of leveraging an organization structure on top of users, or a geography or department view on top of projects. The dashboard can't see the hierarchy. The hierarchy is a formatting item only. So when you're using hierarchies, the dashboards can't see it, so they can't respect it. You would have to set up hard-coded reports that filter on pieces of the hierarchy if you really want to reflect that, or start adding more custom fields. Because as long as you can subtotal with a field, not a hierarchy, that can show up on a dashboard. When you're using company summary reports, remember that is row number 1. If you're doing anything that's not going to use a grand total, it's going to use that as your base x-axis. So many times you'll find that you want to hide that because you do want the second level to become the first level, such as a list of users, list of departments, list of clients. The first level of the subtotal is what will appear on line graphs. The first level of the subtotal is what will show up automatically on bars unless you use grand totals. And when you use the grand totals on bars, it ignores that first level. So if you can remember these 4 items, you'll definitely be ahead of the game in using dashboards within the OpenAir system. Here's an example, capacity versus demand. Okay? A little bit more complicated in the concept, but it's something that you can do in the OpenAir system. So things you can think of outside the box that you wouldn't necessarily think about putting into OpenAir. Capacity is expected hours, expected headcount, expected bill rate, to understand what you can deliver as far as capacity. With those values, that's an equation, and using the custom calculations, you can combine these fields together into a capacity value by person. So why not create that custom field? Why not generate that trend to find out what your capacity is every month, or accumulate it so you know what your capacity is by end of year, and use that as a trend against demand, for example, and compare capacity versus demand in OpenAir. There's no end to the things that you can come up with and try out in the system. And because of that, TopStep actually has identified a new offering based on our use of dashboards and working with the user community. There's a real need out there to sort of identify what are the best metrics that we can get out of the OpenAir system. And there's really 4 major areas: operational management, project management, resource management, and financial management. And in each of those areas, there's levels of maturity based on the types of metrics. Quite often we see utilization. That's always a great metric. Sometimes we see margin, but not all the time. But we do see bill rate, which is a great metric to trend. What about sales cycle? What about project duration? What about project size or financial size? How are you going to get those type of information? And can you trend that information or predict that information based on the data that you're tracking in the OpenAir system? What we do is we work with your organization to do a business operations step-through, so we understand what your goals and objectives are for the company, and we look at each of those 4 areas to understand what you're tracking today and what you would want to track today, or what you should be tracking today based on what's captured in industry. And we take all the information and use our analyzer tool to come up with your ladder metrics scorecard, which is what's called our best practice ladder assessment. And here you can see in this little example, the blue items are what you're measured against, and the brown items are, well, the blue items are the industry standards, and the brown items are what you're being measured against. So how can you close this gap, for example? And then we work with your team to help you close those gaps or step up the ladder so you can become more effective in using your OpenAir system and more effective in getting that optimization out of the system and out of your company for the results that you need. Don't hesitate to email us if you do have any questions. We also have the OpenAir user group on LinkedIn. Feel free to join and contribute to that. We have plenty of people that are parts of membership of that group to answer questions. Contact any of us here at TopStep Consulting. And we also have weekly tips. In fact, this weekly tip was exactly that row versus column view. We also use that on Twitter as well as LinkedIn, so definitely keep in touch with us and let us know what you think, especially feedback. We appreciate that type of information as well. So thank you very much for your participation, and have a good rest of your day.